We're going to go all the way across to Brazil to join Bruno Follador. And Bruno's going to talk about farm-scale compost, integrating compost into the life of the farm. And I'm reliably told by Sean that Bruno is one of the top, if not the top guy in the world when it comes to farm compost. He was born in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and he's an agrarian geographer. He was the founder and director of the Living Soils program at the Nature Institute, and he currently works in Brazil as an adjunct researcher of the Nature Institute, integrates the board of the Brazilian Association of Biodynamic Agriculture, and he consults and gives courses in Latin America, Europe, and in North America. So I'm going to sit back and enjoy this one. Hand over to you, Bruce.
Said Bruce or Bruno?
I'm going to hand over to you, Bruno.
Perhaps there was a Bruce in the room.
Bruce is on my mind, and I have no idea why. Sorry about that.
Well, my wife is called Bruna, so
that's it.
At home. Can you all see my screen?
We can indeed. Yeah, take it away. We can see it very clearly. If you want to put it onto full screen there.
Yes. Well, thank you for being able to be somehow part of this conference. Special thanks to Dave Beecher for making the bridge. The theme, I think the subtitle speaks so much of what I like to share, that to be able to have a successful farm-scale composting process, it should be integrated into the life of the farm. As long as it becomes an appendix, or you only come to the compost site on your day off or at the end of the day, often not only becomes a burden and a psychological stress, but also could have serious consequences for the biology of the farm as a whole. So the question is, how does one integrate the composting process into the life of the farm? While living in the US, often I heard or seen in magazines or t-shirts that compost happens. Yes, indeed it happens, but the question is, how does it happen? Not necessarily by combining different organic matter, be it manures or plant-based compost, or the materials, your raw material. Not necessarily you will have something that deserves the name compost. And the compost itself speaks. So this first picture is in Chile, the vineyard, where a lot of grape pomace is produced. The compost not only will be integrated into the life of the farm, but is integrated into the landscape where the farm is. So there's a constant dialogue between what is socially and biologically happening in the farm itself, but also in the region as a cultural process. So it's not an exaggeration to say that, like much of agriculture, but composting, not because I happen to work so much with it, it stands in a special place of great responsibility. It is a biological event in itself, because it won't happen by nature, like all of agriculture. It is a social event because it involves often, although that's not often recognized, many people. It's a political event because it speaks directly to farms' sovereignty regarding their soil fertility. And it's also a spiritual event. And composting then becomes an expression of what lives on the farm. It's an old saying that if you want to know the health of a farm, one should go to the compost site. But that does not, and it took me a while to begin to understand that. And I don't think it speaks so much to how much compost is being made, if it has enough to cover all the acreage and the hectares of a farm, because in the end, compost is not about nutrients, but the compost will be an expression of what is actually happening in that farm. And I hope you will come to see that. So this is a picture in southern Germany. All of the pictures you will be seeing are places that I have directly worked with. So here we have a very particular situation of whether it's a farm that had 60 Swiss brown, beautiful Swiss brown cows and lots of manure. how does one integrate that with all the vegetable fields they have? Here's a farm in upstate New York area where I was for the last 5 years, where we have very dry winter, sunny winter, but with lots of snow. So how, again, you you go in conversation with the material and the landscape. Here, the temperatures can go to minus 20 Celsius. So extremely cold conditions. Here's a small compost pile in Chile, made by hand. Here, the same farm in New York in a different situation. Here, southern Germany, compost pile made with a compost spreader consisting of bedding, cow manure, and bedding. Here again, the same farm in New York after a composting process was actually integrated into the farm. A compost site in England. Small scale compost pile in New York. And that farm in Germany that you saw, the barn. So, and this is a compost site in Wisconsin. So you can say a view from above from the whole compost site. So in the Midwest of the US. So as you saw in these different pictures, not necessarily all composts were exposed to the same climate conditions and were made out of the same conditions. That said, independent where you find yourself and where your farm is and what happens to be your materials you have to work with, one does not have a dogma within compost, but you have principles. And these principles will express themselves differently in different contexts. And again, not by mixing things, you will get compost. So one thing that everyone can do at their farm is a maturity test. This is 4 glass jars at the farm in Germany where I lived for 3 years. And this jar were filled with different composts, all made from the same manure, but they went through a different process. And you see that the jar on the far right, before I forgot to mention that each jar I placed 20 seeds of wheat. One can also do with watercress and radish seeds. And you see that the jar on the far right did not germinate, or it barely germinated. A few seeds germinated, and then right away they got, sort of say, burned. The jar from left to right germinated well, but once I stopped watering, because I watered just in the beginning, for I wanted to see the water holding capacity, you see that it did not hold the dry conditions, while the jars on the first from left to right and the third held well. So the difference is that how the manure in the bedding was handled, and that's what I'd like to now go into. What I've witnessed and noticed while traveling and going to different farms is that there is a tendency, and I will speak now with the risk of generalizing, but I would like to speak about 2 extreme gestures I have seen in composting. On one side, and this predominates mostly on industrial places, is when one works with turning machines, either PTO driven, as you see this machine. This is a farm that has the main crop asparagus in Mexico. So either PTO driven, and there are different turning machines, but basically it's the principle of a rototiller. They're very beautiful and expensive turning machines, like self-propelled. I don't get any, I should have erased the brand. I don't work for any of these brands. This one I happened to find on the internet. This is a self-propelled machine. Now, want to state already is that I am not against turning machines. There's nothing wrong with them. The question is, how does one work with them? And often in these industrial sites or in some farms that have large volumes that work with turning machines, is that you have a very organized situation. You have all the variables controlled. You have proper CN ratio. You have proper humidity. Aeration is controlled. But many times within a week, a compost pile or a windrow will be turned 8 times. What predominates in this situation is actually a mechanical process of breaking down. These blades are butchering, and one could say raping the organic matter, the mycelium, and all the biological life within the compost. Now, in these situations, often in 2 months, you have a finished product that's bagged and sold in bags or by the tonnage. Often, and again, not all of them, but often when you look at the texture of these composts, it's a very light texture. There's no structure, not necessarily any humus was created, and they often have a very black color. So that has to do with the speed of the process. To try to overcome a little bit of the dryness now of the electronic and virtual medium, having to speak somehow to avoid trusting that there is people there listening. I'd like to read a passage from Nico Kazadzanski, Zorba the Greek, that illustrates when we speed up the process within the compost pile. And this also speaks to all, you can say, process in nature that humanity is involved, from beekeeping to vegetable growing. So this is the passage that I like to share that gives, I would say, a very vivid image of a compost pile that was overturned. I remember one morning when I discovered a cocoon in the back of a tree. Just as a butterfly was making a hole in its case and preparing to come out. I waited a while, but it was too long appearing, and I was impatient. I bent over and breathed on it to warm it. I warmed it as quickly as I could, and the miracle began to happen before my eyes, faster than life. The case opened, the butterfly started slowly crawling out, and I shall never forget my horror when I saw how its wings were folded back and crumpled. The wretched butterfly tried with its whole trembling body to unfold them. Bending over it, I tried to help it with my breath, in vain. It needed to be hatched out patiently, and the unfolding of the wings should be a gradual process in the sun. Now it was too late. My breath had forced the butterfly to appear all crumpled before its time. It struggled desperately, and a few seconds later died in the palm of my hands. So this is this one gesture that could take form in these places where compost is handled in these extreme scenarios. The other pole is when compost piles are often made in the classical lasagna style or the black forest cake style, where you have one layer of manure, one layer of your greens, and one layer of your brown. So you're setting up the strata of your carbon and nitrogen. That's how I've learned in the beginning. This is quite a while, like maybe 12 or maybe 15 years ago in the Atlantic rainforest, as I worked with banana growers. So one layer of cow manure, then came the banana leaves, manure again. Here it's a compost, very small but well made, lasagna style pile in New York. This is a chaotic process of assembling this pile, but more or less following this principle. This is in Wisconsin. What happens in these situations, I hope you guys can see the pen. Here you have a high concentration of apples, high for this volume. You have a high concentration of water. The straw is on this side. You have leaks here. And material was gathered and then piled up. And what happened is that the pile was left by itself. So the farmers and gardeners were coming back 6 months, 7 months, 8 months later. Here in this bush is actually a compost pile that was overtaken by weeds over here. I will speak soon on what is actually happening on a biological stand to these piles. Here it's in New Hampshire, US, where this is not a hedgerow, an attempt of a hedgerow. This is actually compost pile that were completely overtaken by weeds. Over here. And I will have more picture of this because this is what seems to predominate on most farms. This is a picture that you saw in the beginning in southern Germany. This is the farm that I lived but did not work. And I saw this pile from my room. You see from the landscape, it's within an orchard. It's summertime, and you see that the grass is beginning to take over the compost pile. In the beginning, it had a very beautiful size. It was steaming, but as spring developed into summer, it began to decrease in size. And what entered as a process was a cold anaerobic process. I will speak shortly to that. This is a compost pile in France, in the Alsace region, again following the same gesture. It was assembled and then it was left by itself. This is about a year old. You see that's knee high. This is a large farm in England, and where there are livestock. There's lots of animals, cows, pigs. There's also a vegetable garden. There's a restaurant. So not only the farmer responsible for the compost site has to deal with the manure from the animals, but also has to deal with all the scraps coming from the restaurant area. And that was a very frustrating process for him because there was no proper communication with the other areas, and often the food scraps are being dumped on top of the covers. Here, and you had an ongoing, because it's a farm that has a lot of animals, it's non-stop, the quantity of manures year-round. And here you begin to see leachate, which is extremely detrimental to soil health in our water tables, going into the fields. And here you have a very chaotic process taking place. This is another place in England, well organized, but biologically the piles are suffering. Although there's a gutter here, and I'll speak about organizing the site, but the gutter was not able to hold the amount of water coming down. So there was an excess of water going into these piles. And again, what predominated here was anaerobic process. Another area of the farm, of that same farm, where manures were composted. And you see here a very clear picture of manures going into putrefaction, very stinky smell, uncomfortable to work with. Even though at this place they had compost covers. Let me just make sure I have a watch with me. Yes, okay. So here, again, another example. In Germany, there's a practice they call Stapelmist, where they pile up the barn manure outside the barn, and until it's time to apply it. If one does a cross section with a bucket from the tractor or a skid loader, you see how it is completely anaerobic. You have a process of reduction here. And as it became black or dark here because it began to oxidize. But you see in this region where I'm circling, if I did not cover it too much with my red electronic pen, you see that it's still yellow and green even after 5-6 months of sitting there. So what is happening often in these situations where you have either a well-organized compost pile, like in this case, with your different layers, your brown and your greens, your carbon and your nitrogen, or in situation where the pile was totally chaotically assembled. If one leaves the pile by itself, even though it was well made, especially if the layers are thick, you don't have a communication between these different strata. The heart or the hearth of the compost, better said, it's this red area here. You can say the top triangle, the top of the triangle. And in these situations where the pile was not turned, in one area you might get high temperatures. Sometimes it could go more than 70 Celsius. At these temperatures, your carbon, as one of the pillars of humus, is burned and you have ashes. You have a tremendous loss of carbon. At the same time, when not enough heat was given to the material and how it was mixed, for example, in that farm in Mexico that were using the PTO driven, where they had lots of asparagus and vegetables, they were doing strata, and at times they were not mixing it enough. You have one area that's very wet to another area that's very dry. Composting, one can learn a lot from bread makings. Often bread makers and winemakers and cheese makers are excellent compost makers because they understand the need that in composting we're not controlling something, but we are guiding a biological process, and we need to give conditions and set up for different phases and stages. When we leave the compost pile by itself, of course, something will happen and nature somehow will take its course, but we offer a burden to nature. At the same time, when we don't guide and care also for protecting the pile from the rain or the snow or the heat, we get a lot of leachate. That's nutrients leaving the compost pile. So you have that very dark brown, oily cry, this leaching out of the pile. So you have at times leaching out from the pile, and then you have the water going into the pile, and you have that leaching. So you begin to have this totally chaotic situation, high temperatures, but then within these high temperatures that is developed by the life of the farm, by the bacteria, you have a consumption of oxygen. So you have a depletion of oxygen by this activity. And as rain goes into the pile, it occupies the space there present. And so in the end, you have an anaerobic process with highly undesirable microbial life for soil health. And what happens that after 6 months or 7 or 8 months, usually, when the farmer comes back, only when you have your pile here, only this top part, it's often checked by hand or with a shovel, but then the core here underneath is not seen. So after 8 months, 6, of course, this upper part here will have decomposed more. But often if you do a cross section of this compost pile, this inner core will be mushy, green, bluish, disgusting substance. And that often gets loaded into the manure spreader or your wheelbarrow. I hope I'm not speaking too fast and my English can be understood. This is a compost pile in New York, upstate New York, where it was placed on the side of a field. in spring, and now you can see in this picture that it's autumn. This pile had around over 70% moisture content. You see the color is very black. And when it was spread, it was a normal traditional manure spreader driven by a tractor. You see that the spreader, the beater, was not powerful enough to break this mass. And so you had a very inefficient spreading. And within this condition, you concentrate that mass into a smaller area. And by putting that substance, unhealthy substance on your field year after year, even though your cows are well loved, they all have beautiful names and bells that ring in the spring as they run to see their first fodder, if the manure was not guided well enough, it's a violence we cause to our soil and to our farm. We could be driving our potassium and phosphorus levels up to the roof, increasing the weed pressure. And by having such a raw state, there's research showing that it depletes calcium levels, silicon. We disrupt our pH of our soil, often making it more acidic. And you begin to have all these chance conditions. So you can have manure or this substance that has a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. You're going to cause a temporary nitrogen deficient because your soil is going to have to digest that high amount of nitrogen, and also will deplete oxygen from your root zone. The opposite, when you have a lot of nitrogen, undigested nitrogen, crude material, your soil will take from its humus resource carbon to balance that. I'm running, it's late. We started late though. I painted this two extreme. On one side where we speed up the process and we have more of a mechanical breakdown and a decomposition, not necessarily any upbuilding. Of course, biology will be present. And this other extreme where you have a putrefied anaerobic substance being placed and given to our soil. The challenge is then how to navigate between these two extremes. And what has helped me is to, instead of try to somehow follow mathematical formula and rules, which have a reality. So CN ratio, most of the literature will say from 25 to 1 to 35 to 1, most books staying on the 30 to 1 ratio. But what does that actually mean when you have worked all day, you're working on the compost site on your day off, you haven't been home for dinner on time since spring began or since the farm began, and you're supposed to find a 30-to-1 ratio and you have over 40 tons of material to mix with. So what has helped me is actually to inquire and start looking at the qualities of the substance I'm working with, meaning the quality of my materials in relationship to my landscape. So here in Chile, for example, it's a very dry place with very hot weather. And I'm working at times in places where I have a lot of pumice with stems, as this is the pile you see on your left, and you have horse manures at times. So I'm already beginning with dry materials in a dry place. Ideally, I want to create a harmony between the elements, and I'll go into these elements now. If we look at cow manure and straw, a beautiful combination, especially wheat or rye straw that will give a beautiful structure to your compost pile, different than hay. All material are beautiful to work with, but we need to understand how they will play their role and what are their needs. So in itself, bedding could find an ideal composition. I will show more pictures soon. One can work with a lot of plant matter. In cases like this farm in France, there was not a lot of animal manure, only a little bit from the neighbor. We started to mow the perimeter of the garden and other fields, and we brought in a high diversity of plant material from grasses to Chlamylifolium, yarrow, dandelion, plantain. One could also integrate the rotation of cover crops into the life of the composting process. So one could mow it, leave it on the field, or also one can begin to harvest some of this cover crop. This is the farm in Germany. You can see some of the cover crops being planted. This is a farm I worked with, a dear friend in Illinois, where we did actually a large scale experiment. It was not my idea to be a large scale, but he likes big machines. And ideally, we were going to only harvest 1 hectare of cover crop to mix with the straw and horse manure he was receiving from his neighbor. So we would bring in nitrogen. But he chopped a lot of acreage, and we had around 13 to 15 semi-loads. So when I arrived there on Friday, I saw that the truck didn't stop coming, bringing a mixture of cover crops. And I became quite concerned. Here you see the straw, some mature, older compost, and what to do in this situation. So actually the first thing I did was to completely saturate this material, the cover crop, even though when I squeezed my hands, green juice would fall out. Because if I were to bring water to the straw, or once things were mixed, it would not really hold this water. So after I brought in the water, then we mixed, and here you see a picture from the pile. The compost piles are on the other side of this hump. You can work with algae from sweetwater lakes, like in Wisconsin. There's one place we'd receive 70 tons per week from the town. They needed a place to give that, so the farm happily took that in. Or you can also work with algae from the ocean. So it's important that you pay attention to your material. I wish I could. I find myself like a bit of like a compost turner, speaking too fast. I apologize. So that's what I wanted to say. I wish I could spend more time building a picture of different substances. Yes? Okay. To give a picture of the substances. So horse manure, we'd read in the literature, it's hot as opposed to hog manure or cow. It begins to help, and I don't mean that this is taken abstractly, but very concretely, is to ask, once the substance you're working with is there in front of you, is who are you? How did you grow? How did you behave? Because that will help give you an inkling how the substance will behave as you work with. When you look at the cow as this beautiful ruminant, as the sacred ruminant, that the salivary glands is bigger than the volume of her brain. So the amount of saliva she produces, it's an incredible amount of liters and liters and liters of saliva. The 4 chambers of digestion that she has, the amount of blood and milk that flows through her udder, and the amount of milk she gives. When you look at her nozzle, it's moist. Yes? So, and when you see the cow, especially after she spent a long winter inside the barn eating dry fodder, when she has that fresh grass in spring, and she lifts up her tail, and you have that waterfall of manure coming out of her end. When you look at the horse as an organism, first, it's not a ruminant. It has these teeth, completely different organs of digestion. It's a much more choleric animal. The cow is more of a monk creature. So when you see the power of a horse galloping, so that will play in a very concrete way in how the substance will work, yeah? That's where I wish we could build more of a pictures, but I just wanted to give a small glimpse of what I mean by asking who is in front of you. And you can do that for all your nitrogenous material, and you do this for your carbonaceous material. You have straw from wheat, which is different from hay. It will give a different structure. So not all carbon and not all nitrogen is the same, and that must be given the due respect. Leaves, it's a beautiful material that can be added. The town would bring this to the farm in Wisconsin. Special important is to, if you bring in materials from outside, is to make sure there's no herbicides or heavy metals, yeah? So it's a very delicate thing always when we bring things from outside into the farm. But that's one way that we can increase the diversity of carbonaceous material. For vineyards, all the pumice, but you see, each material has a different characteristic. Yeah, look at this pumice and how it all it intertwines together. That's in Chile. When we look at our barns, it makes a difference if I'm mucking out where the young animals are, because you have a different digestive process, not yet mature, a different manure. So, and of course, it depends on the availability of hay and different carbonaceous material that could be given to the animals to bring comfort, yes, but that will also play into your compost. But when I look at this picture, for example, I'm already, this is a farm in New York, the animals are very clean. And if I know how, if this has been throughout the whole winter, I know that this muck from this bubble barn, it's an open bubble barn, it will have a high carbon ratio. Now, the same bubble, if you stop bringing in the bedding, the straw, you see that very rapidly it changes the condition of your CN ratio. I'm going to have more urine and manure. So as I am taking that, it's important that I know the history, the biography of this bedding. Lactating cows and mature cows, again, different conditions. The weather will play a role, like I've mentioned, yes? And you're back again to your carbonaceous material. It's important the size of the particles. So it's important to reduce the size, either mechanically through machines or in Brazil in the Northeast with machetes. Now, I spoke a bit of the quality of the materials. As I mix, I'll speak about the mixing. You have the 4 elements being expressed in the substance, but then also in the pile. The first element you will see in the pile is warmth. Independent that you have a strong winter, piles can reach 50 Celsius. But the warmth needs to be guided, and it gets guided by how you have mixed the composition and by turning of your pile. Of course, moisture content. If you don't turn, you see that here it has ash. You have a moist here, but inside the core, it's dry. So it's important to do a cross section with your bucket or with your fork. This is a farm in Kentucky in the US, south of the US. You see that it's bone dry. It has heated. It reached, and it was still hot, even though you have a high dryness. You can still have 60 Celsius, 70 Celsius. 70 moist, that doesn't exist. Whew. Okay, so it comes the air, like I said, by turning and by mixing your material, and also by the height of your pile. If it's too high, you have too much pressure underneath, you don't leave room for it. Here you have different means of turning. I'll go into the turning cycle soon. A special note should be given to wood chips as a carbonaceous material is that, yes, it is carbon, but it has a lot of lignin. So as you introduce wood chips, 2 by 2, yeah, small size wood chips, it is not your carbon source in the beginning of your composting process because of the high lignin content. It's actually a bulk agent. It's going to give structure to your pile. This carbon was going to be available down the road more of your compost pile. So it is hay, your different straw, leaves, that or thin branches of soft wood. That's your carbon source. Then we have water. Literature will say from 40 to 60%. Ideally, one should stay within the 50 range, yeah? Because you need a water reservoir to go through your whole composting process. That's a rig that this Kentucky farmer developed to water the piles, yeah? There doesn't matter. One can be creative depending on financial conditions and machinery and people, but the compost should start off with good moisture because the piles will tend to become hydrophobic. The water will not stand. That's in Chile, for example. They have water too late and it was bone dry. You see that the water only stayed in a small area, even though a lot of water was put into it. But then you have to guide the water from the beginning, but also water that comes from heaven and water in snow form. Here, it's too much water. It's a soup. It was a mess. And you have this very environmental, catastrophic issue of the leachate going into the streams in our water table. And finally, we come to the fourth element, which is earth, soil. I already can say that one should, and that's indication by the great soil scientist and biodynamic farmer Edenfried Pfeiffer, that one should add 10% ideally of a soil with a good content of clay to whatever amount of materials you're working with. So we spoke about this quality of the materials, the elements that also is present in the landscape. You should pay attention what elements dominate in your region to bring harmony into all that. Then comes the time of actually mixing this. Like bread baking, one should not have all the raisins or the salt in 1/3 of the bread loaf. We want to, or at least I like to have a good, generous raisin throughout the whole loaf. And the composting process should be the same. You have all your material well mixed. That guarantees that the process will be able to happen through all the different stratas, but that you don't have separate strata, you have an integrated body. Now, how you mix, again, that depends on the size of the farm, the size of the site, machines, people, but I have often worked more than anything else with different buckets from different, because often, at least the farms I've been in Europe and in the US, often that's the machinery that's there available. Here you see, it's a small video. So how one mixes this, one way is that you put different layers as if you were making a lasagna. But once you have a small amount, not too high, you go in with the teeth of the bucket and you go in, and then you spread, you drag it out. As you can see in this video, that's a farm, small CSA in New York. And you see that the bucket is dragging it out. And as you drag out, you go again with your bucket and you pick that up and you feather it with your bucket and you go around from the different sides. Another possibility is actually to build a whole pile, and you turn it right away. A tip regarding the mixing is that the mixing begins where the material is generated. So that's the vineyard where all the wine is going to be made. So where the pumice is coming out already should be given a lot of attention, because that's where compost begins. They were forcing a lot of pumice inside this trailer and they were dumping it like a nice trapezoid in the compost site. But then the poor person that was working there could not separate that. So there was a breakage in the social component. In a lot of time, diesel and quality was wasted. So here, ideally, all your material is nicely separated and not put into a chaotic mess. So here, it was very hard to get. This is actually manure that was completely dry. We can ask, is this really manure, or has become something else that has manure quality in it? Just some pictures to illustrate that. So here is your barn in New York. So here compost begins. And that, in this farm, there was around 60 cows. There was a conveyor that would bring this 2 buckets per week into a house shed, a manure shed. And in the beginning, they were just dumping and filling this. And it was a catastrophe. It was a disgusting thing. In winter, it was okay because everything froze. But as spring came, it was a biological bomb and extremely uncomfortable to work with. And also a very noxious and dangerous substance that was being spread to the fields. Yeah. Here you see chance conditions. Again, you have anaerobic conditions, but here you see that it was hot and it ashed. You see a picture. The process needs to be fully organized. The surrounding of your site, you can have the most beautiful process, but if your perimeter is full of seeds of weeds you don't want in your fields, they will go into your compost site or your ingredients. You should pay attention to gutters coming from the roof so you don't bring in excess of water. Here, for example, yeah, all the material was stored under this roof, so we brought that out and changed it because it didn't make sense to put gutters there. Here you see, so the first step then is begins to organize the process where the material is coming out. You see that around the manure shed, soil was placed so that I'm not driving with the machinery to bring the soil. The ingredients are separated. It's like a kitchen chef, yeah? All the ingredients are separated, cut beforehand so the magic can happen. The leaves are brought in and separated from the wood chips, from moldy moldy bales of hay. And you see that's the same manure shed. And now we have the liquid manure coming from the milk parlor on the right side, mixed material on the middle, and you see on the left more of a carbonaceous material. So the material comes in, it gets mixed because this farm receives a lot of constant material all the time. Instead of making compost in that 2 weeks of spring, which becomes almost an impossible, heroic task, if you dilute the process throughout the year and you constantly making compost, you begin to really integrate it. So you see, you have material coming in, it gets mixed. Skid steers, independent of the brand. Again, I don't work for any of these machine brands. That's just the brand it had. It's this machine, particularly the skid steer, it's such a joy to work with because it's so fast and agile. You can really actually dance around it. It becomes fun. At this farm, because there were different sections, the garden crew, the market garden, the livestock, we placed a message board. In the end, they did not take that, but nonetheless, farms have taken a message board saying, hey, drop this material in this area, because not necessarily there will be always a guard there watching to make sure that things go in the right place. So you see this view from a compost site. Oh, excuse me. So you have these, it's one group of a particular age that already have been mixed. Another group here, it's one section that has been mixed, this TP form. Here in dark, it's my ingredients, the faithful truck that would haul material, and one should always give room for access for the machine to go in and out. And this is the mixing area. So material would be come in, it would get mixed, it puts into a you can say mixing pile. And then that can wait a week or 2 weeks, but that's already in transformation until you get more material to actually make your windrow. Here you see this example of this piles that have been mixed, and in the back, your windrows. Setting the pile, so after everything was mixed, you set your pile. This is a vineyard in northern Italy, and as we set this windrow opposite from the contour line, yeah, so you see the vines going with the terrain. The piles should go perpendicular to the lay of the land, so the water coming from the hill would not stay on the feet of your compost pile, so you don't get wet feet, because the pile will soak up that. And the side, on the size of the pile, it should be about 1.5 meters high. It should be not too high, again, because you have too much pressure. And if you come from the side, you get naturally a triangular shape, as you can see here. At times, there's a farm in Kentucky, we were working with 2 machinery, a skid steer and a tractor, to make things faster. One should make sure the pile is not too fat and chubby, so that you can walk in between the windrows. It becomes more comfortable to walk, but also the compost, it's a being in the way of becoming a being. It needs to have a beginning and an end, like a garden bed has. Mention the covers so I don't forget. Covers are a very dear friend of compost makers. There are different brands and materials. Straw, as beautiful as they are, I don't find them to be something good, because often there's not high availability. They don't guarantee protection from rain and snow. And when it comes to turning cycle, you have to remove that straw, otherwise you will introduce carbon in the wrong time. And as you hold the covers, my suggestion, don't use tires. I find them aesthetically unpleasing, and they become a source for mosquitoes breeding ground. And even though you might slash cuts when you throw the tires, often you get a splash of disgusting, especially if the things are not going well, and there goes a few curses off your mouth, at least mine. Here you see a very nice, well-organized site. The piles are covered, they are mixed. The compost site should always be clean. It should not stay in the back of your farm where your tourists never reach it. Although in your brochure, often compost is speaked in high regards, but yet the tourists never make it actually to the site. I have witnessed many farms that are there in these conditions. Here's a farm that the compost is too high. So here is too low with a manure spreader. Here, nice organization. I'm sorry, I have to go a little bit faster now, even more than I'm going, just to illustrate a little bit. Now, turning the pile becomes important, and I'm coming to an end. You see that here's the core that needs oxygen. If we don't reintroduce the oxygen, you will end up with an anaerobic process. Here you can see it's very wet, even though it has the covers. You can notice that by the shape of the windrow. And so when to turn, that becomes the very tricky question. Ideally, and that's from experience on farms, one should not go more than 1 month without turning. So within 4 weeks, you should turn at least once. Now, when are the red flags? Temperatures above 65 Celsius, you should turn earlier. Too wet, turn earlier. The pile became all like that, turn earlier. So you're always asking, can I hold? But depending on the conditions, you will turn on the first week, second week, third week, but not more than 4 weeks. You turn, temperature drops, but it will bounce back up. You want the pile to have this high sanitation fever, this thermophilic phase. It can hold for a month. Eventually, the pile will go to your thermic ambient environment temperature. So here you see a beautiful pile that's a young compost. You can see that the upper layer, very nice chocolate color, but still the core smells like ammonia. So this, if I wanted a very humified compost, a very mature compost, I turn it one more time. You can see as a tip, the thermometer here goes through the side around here, because that's the hot spot. So this profile of the pile becomes a very beneficial activity to do to monitor the pile along with your temperature. Yeah, that's an example. At the bottom, you see that's a pumice of compost. That's not compost really. You see here at the bottom the skin of the grapes, even after months and months have not developed. But where my hand is, you see that it developed fungal and it was warm. So in 3 months, if one takes this process through, paying attention to all of this, you can already have a beautiful pile. What is present in this process is bacteria, actomycetes, and fungi. You won't see any California worms. And so within 5 months in temperate climates, that's south of Germany, the whole winter from top to bottom has this very beautiful chocolate, 70%, 60, 75% cacao color to it. And you see that it actually builds aggregates, humus. And when you place that into your soil, it's efficient. And you see the difference. After a process was integrated, that you don't have any leachate coming out. That's the same place. And you see that's only soil that's from the area, yeah? Not erosion. So what we're doing in composting, we're guiding this so that we're actually offering something for the earth. And I'm sorry I didn't go into details of more clay or sandy soils. I wanted to give within the time frame a bit of a picture of these two extreme gestures and this one gesture where we are actually in conversation with the compost pile, in conversation with our landscape. So then everything is embedded in this beautiful dance, yeah? So that's why I've mentioned in the beginning that a compost pile is a social event, and it can heal a lot of conflicts within a farm. If the farm site or the compost site becomes this place that is fully integrated, yeah? So I think for now, it's more than time, I think, for me to stop. I would like to thank you all. For now, it's so far like this. Thank you.
Bruno, thanks a million. Can you hear us here?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. That was just fascinating. And I'm not surprised that we have an awful lot of questions coming in. So we've got about 10 minutes, if that's okay with you, Bruno.
Oh yeah, I could stay. If you tell me I can stay another 4 hours, I'll stay. I'll make a cup of coffee.
Okay,
That'll actually be better.
Well, loads of questions. So I'm going to fly through them. The first one is from Anya Gordon. She says, quick question for Bruno. In Ireland, farmyard manure cannot be field stored over winter due to nutrient leaching. Is this the case around the world as far as what you have seen?
Well, it depends, again, like I've mentioned, how you store it. If you have a manure shed one thing is what the government's imposing on farmers. The other thing is what is the reality of the farm. If you have a shed, you're protecting it from the rain. But if you didn't organize the material as it was coming in, especially through winter, you will have leachate. So it becomes important that as you're arranging this material, that you make sure to add your carbon and your 10% soil, and you begin to mix, because then you're storing in a safe way. Then the laws from the government becomes detrimental to the farmer's autonomy, because then I don't need a law because I'm not causing harm to my water and soil.
Okay, John A asks, what population of worms can you expect, or does the heat kill them all?
Well, you see, what I've spoke about is a process of composting that works with high temperatures within the thermophilic range, not going above 65 Celsius. Yeah, so I'm working mostly with bacteria, actomycetes, which is a special type of bacteria, and fungi. The red wrigglers, the red worms, they belong in a colder process. Within this process I described, they have no home. So I won't see them. But by spreading this compost out onto the field in my gardens, I will have the earthworms, which is a different worm than the red wigglers. The worms actually I want on my fields, yeah?
Okay, and he also asks, is this style of making compost just a timing issue? Eventually it'll all be of benefit to the soil. Are we not better to worry about the 5-year horizon?
Wait, I didn't understand. Could you repeat that, please?
He said, is this style of making compost just a timing issue? Eventually it'll all be of benefit to the soil. Are we not better to worry about the 5-year horizon?
Not at all. I've witnessed coffee farms in Mexico, vineyards in England, in other places where what was being placed, even though it had loved or inattention, actually caused such detrimental that in this particular coffee farm in Mexico, they were losing 40% of the new coffee trees they were planting. And that had to do 98% to the compost, which was not compost that they were spreading. So at times, it's better not to make compost if one is not able to do it responsibly, because one can do a lot of damage by leaving it to the grace of God to take care of. And actually, nature will be quite, I would say, disappointed and left alone by our lack of responsibility.
Yes. Phil Masterson asks, is biochar addition beneficial in the composting process?
Yes, it can be beneficial. I didn't mention rock dust. One could integrate different types of rock dust from basalt to other minerals that could be added more or less around 5% regarding these minerals. I have never personally worked with biochar, but yes, it can definitely be more beneficial if one actually introduces into the beginning of the compost process as opposed to using biochar by itself onto the fields.
And from aquatic systems, Bruno, things like seaweed, presumably also?
Yes. In one sense, all materials can be used. It's a question of how one's used them.
Jamie asks, what's the difference between aerobic composting and anaerobic processes such as making bokashi, this process that converts food waste into a sort of a soil amendment?
Yeah, thank you for that. So not necessarily all anaerobic process is detrimental to soil health, yes? Bokashi, I have no experience personally, but that you have a very, you can say, guided in particular environment where a substance is mixed and guided through. So it has a beginning and an end. What I see on farms is that you have different organic matter that goes into anaerobic conditions where then what predominates is a reduction process. You have productions of methane and other toxic substances and an unhealthy bacterial population.
We have a question about rainfall. In a high rainfall country like Ireland, will good compost be able to keep the moisture from getting too high?
I'm not sure if I understood, but if you have a soil that has a beautiful structure with plenty of humus, of course, then the humus will be able, like a sponge, to absorb. Like here, we have these massive rains that come, but then a soil can cope with this excess rain. A soil that is mineralized cannot cope with this rain. I'm not sure if your question was in this direction.
No.
And so if it was, compost will definitely contribute to be able to handle this excess of water that will come at different times of the year.
It's a more self-regulating question, is it? Sorry, I'm just going to get clarification from Sean here from that question.
I think Bruno, what that question is about, because there's so much rain in Ireland, will that keep the moisture from, keep the compost from getting too high, the temperature in it? It's in the compost making process.
Yeah, it's a good question, but then you have to take seriously that you're in Ireland. And I mean that very seriously. And then becomes the question, so the element then predominates, there is water. How do I bring air and warmth into this process? So that will demand, the outside environment will ask for me on one side protection, that will come through covers or buildings, and also from bringing in a nice, mixture of carbonaceous material and your turning cycle. That means that perhaps in this situation, you were going to have to turn it earlier. Instead of waiting 4 weeks, you're going to turn within 1 week, because by turning, you drive the moisture out.
Bruno, you mentioned about bread makers being good compost makers, and Conor O'Leary asks, would there be a benefit in mixing some of a previous year's compost with your new batch, like a starter in yogurt, he says?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, there's so much that was left unsaid. When I've mentioned adding this 10% of soil with good clay content, actually what you should have on your site is this amount of soil / mature compost. So you never spread all 100% of your compost, but then you have a blend of soil and compost, because that's like your yogurt starter. It will give certain wisdom to that pile that's not yet a pile yet.
That's interesting.
So that's definitely beneficial to save and introduce some of that compost together with soil. And of course, one should not rob soil from a garden, yeah? One should look for a berm or a construction site, please. I've seen people, oh yeah, we need soil, and then you go with the machine and you ruin a nice vegetable crop. Love compost.
Bruno, one of the questions, I suppose looking at some of the really interesting photographs you showed of some composts that have just gone wrong or too dry, like the one in Mexico, is there a way to rescue those at all? So before you actually use it, is there a way to rescue it, or does it just become too late?
There's often a way, but not necessarily you will have, that's important to realize that the quality will be different, yeah? So a compost in some of the pictures that were fully anaerobic, in these situations, I would actually, of course, not spread that, and then reintroduce that into a new cycle. A situation that was caught early enough, sometimes just by turning, you could have a dry top, but you could have a very moist bottom. So just by turning, you balance that out. Or if it's too hot and dry, one could open that and introduce water. One should also pay attention at the time of the day that one is turning the pile. If in Ireland, I'm wet, the compost pile is wet, you should, if possible, organize the agenda to turn it at the high heat of the day, so that the 2 o'clock sun will drive the moisture out. If I have a cold pile, also, I'm not going to turn it early in the morning. I'm going to turn it in the middle of the day. So it depends. I once was very scared to, in that, I'm not deviating, please trust me on this one. I was scared to participate in a Q&A with good friends that were high experts. And I became quite calm when I realized that for every possible question, there's only 2 answers. It depends, and I don't know. Because it always depends on the conditions and on the context.
Well, there you go, that's fair enough. I love the idea of there being a high heat and 2 o'clock in Ireland, anywhere in Ireland. Brian Murphy asks, Bruno, all the systems you show require turning in space. Have you used forced aeration systems?
I have not. I visit sites that have worked with them, and you can work very well because you're introducing air by through a ventilation system, and it's possible. Again, I would suggest that you have a proper mixture and should not layer it out.
And Davey McGovern asks, does Bruno have a view on Johnson Su bioreactors, i.e. a fungi-rich zero-turn aerobic methodology?
I'm not familiar with this one.
Okay. Sean has 2 questions.
Yeah, Bruno, thanks. That was really, really good. You know, in organic growers in particular, I suppose, And maybe I should even go further and say even organic vegetable growers, compost is often the sole fertilizer input to have. And is there a danger to overuse, and does it cause we'll say, a nutrient imbalance in the soil? Is that a possibility, or am I just not living in the real world?
Like I've mentioned, if it is not well made and depending on the condition of the soil, one can create a lot of damage. You can create a physical, biological, and chemical danger and problems to your soil. Like I've mentioned, you can drive potassium and phosphorus too high. You can deplete your calcium and your silicon. You can deplete your nitrogen if it's too much carbon going in. When you have, but that's in the conditions where compost was not well made. When you have compost that actually went through, because you have a decomposition phase of your compost, but then it goes into a recomposition. And then the humification components, when you have a composition, when you have that, you can play with a younger compost, especially for clay, heavy, tight clay soils. You can work with younger compost, but that's not compost that is in a crude situation. And for sandier soils, you can work with a more stable, mature compost. But ultimately, in the beginning, when you have a more mineralized soil, if you're in a conversion, you can use more compost. But compost should not, in my view, be seen as your source of nutrients. Of course, nutrients will be present, but actually we're bringing humus to the soil. Of course, nutrients, but we're bringing humus and healthy microbial life to your soil and gardens. And one will not have danger if you have humified compost, I would say, with all the care saying that with people I'm not seeing. But one should not need to put so much if your soil is already good enough, yeah?
Bruno, can I ask, Jim Cronin, I don't know whether you heard him earlier, he sort of ended his talk by saying that, you know, farmers should also speak to older farmers from the area to understand the land and get their wisdom. And I wonder, when it comes to compost, I mean, there's so many books in the past have been written about it. There's so much knowledge already. And would it be your sort of notion that it's important to read what has been written about in the deep past to understand how to do it properly?
Absolutely. One interesting book is Farmers of 40 Centuries, yeah? That's far away in Asia, not close to Brazil or Ireland, but it speaks how people value substances and how they transformed and how they were able then in Korea and Japan to offer fertility for centuries and centuries. So absolutely we should honor the knowledge from the elders, but that not to say that because a book was written in the 1950s and is speaking a certain thing and doesn't correspond to reality, one should not follow the book.
And finally, Bruno, you said at the beginning of your talk the idea of compost being political and, you know, the idea of farm sovereignty regarding soil biology. Can you just briefly expand on that a bit more before we finish?
Composting can become a burden and can become a sacrifice. In my view, it is an enormous sacrifice with the amount of work the farmer already has, with the misunderstanding society has towards the farmers and gardeners. But when we look at the root of the word sacrifice, it means sacro officio, sacred duty. If we take it seriously, humus and humanity have the same etymological root. We could ask, what is the relationship then between soil erosion and social conflicts? If I am actually making compost in my farm and bringing that into the soil, not by wish to increase my yields or to make waste management, but actually as a devotion to the earth, as a responsibility I have in transforming this substance that could become noxious to life, then becomes a true sacrifice. And it becomes a free deed that the farmers can do in freedom, not because someone told them, but because they love the earth. And by doing that, they create, within, of course, all the other activity that involves in farming, not only, I would say, physical sovereignty regarding nutrients of not having to buy things from outside, but they go in the direction of a spiritual sovereignty where they're not dependent on what the state tells me. Like I've heard in England that they have to rotate and farmers being prohibited in making compost when farmers are making beautiful compost. In that sense, we can become free from an outside authority, and we can become free in our relationship to the earth, in service to the earth and humanity.
Well, that's a
In that
really...
sense, it becomes a political and a humanitarian activity.
That's a really meaningful end to your talk, Bruno, and I'm so grateful to you for your time. I'm so glad also that it's going to be available on YouTube for people to look back and listen to what you have to say. And all I can say is we send our regards here from Ireland, and thank you very much indeed for your talk and answering the questions so well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno.